Hello and welcome to Beacon Hill Update, produced by Millis Community Media. I'm Peter Themistocles. I'm a member of the MCM Board of Directors, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to host and facilitate this program. Beacon Hill Update is a quarterly one-on-one with our elected state representatives. Our program is split into two parts. The first is an unrehearsed question and answer session with a couple questions from residents. And then we'll turn the mic over to our representative to discuss some of the issues and legislation he is working on. Our goal is to simply present an organic conversation with our elected officials. Millis is fortunate to have two elected representatives to the Massachusetts State General Assembly. Today on Beacon Hill Update, we're happy to welcome back James Arena-DeRosa of the 8th Middlesex District, which includes the towns of Millis, Holliston, Hopkinton, and Sherburne. Welcome back, James.
Thanks, Peter. Delighted to be back with you.
Let's start with a quick update on a couple of items from our last conversation. Beginning with educational funding and that strain it's put on small towns like Millis and other towns like us in the Commonwealth. Since we have spoken, has there been any improvements or changes made in the way that reimbursement formula is calculated, in the way the funding occurs in that process we discovered?
There are a few positive things. I still think we have a long-term challenge where the small towns get squeezed, but I'll be working on that in the years to come. We did double the minimum amount going to all the small towns from $30 to $60 per student, $60 per student, so that'll help a little bit. I know there were some concerns here about the extraordinary increase that the Baker administration put in on sped ed at the very end with tuition for out-of-district placements. We put $20 million in the budget to help mediate that a little bit, and there's actually another $75 million for towns that face extraordinary challenges. I think Melissa's going to have to look through some formulas and details on whether they get some of that money, but we think they will. That's going to help a little bit. I think education is one of the biggest items in the budget. Every year, every town struggles with it. Two quick things that will help. We did pass universal school meals. Every child will get free meals during the day. That's going to give $1,200 per child for every parent that has a child in the school system. So I think that helps. It also helps a town like Millis that certainly had some young people that were eligible for the program, but a lot weren't, and then it eliminates the stigma, who's in which line. I think it's important that every kid eats every day, and I think that's just going to help with the overall educational mission of the town. The challenge I see is that, to me, we don't want to pit sped ed against regular ed, but right now, we should be rewarding the towns that do the right thing. Millis does the right thing, and actually there are parents that move here because they do well by their kids with special ed. And so the state then turns around and makes them pay more. It should be the other way around. We should be reimbursing them more for that. And I think right now we're working, there are some bills in progress to give a higher reimbursement on transportation and also upping the amount that goes for each child that a town has in the system. So we'll see how that plays out, but I know it's a big challenge for the town of Millis.
Certainly is. Last time, you also mentioned the idea of getting a small town caucus going on Beacon Hill to address issues like support for seniors and other issues like that. Again, these small town concerns. Is there any update on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm starting those conversations. It's going to take a while, but it's interesting. Another huge challenge, I'll jump ahead a little, but we can come back to it if we need to. A lot of towns have aging infrastructure, and right now the state government, has no money for things like town halls, senior centers, fire stations, but all the small communities are facing millions of dollars in expenses to replace it. Why aren't we providing some funding for that? And so we have a small group that's starting to meet together and talking about that. So those things take time to build, but there's definitely some interest in it. So we'll see how that plays out over time.
All right, thank you. Now let's move on to some new topics and questions from residents. Sure. Last fall, there were updates made to language in the firearms bill that was passed in the House. This is now being considered in the Senate. Correct. Assuming some measure of these updates pass into law this year, how will these updates impact the people of Millis regarding gun safety?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, and as you may recall, the House of Representatives, the leadership put forward a comprehensive firearms legislation bill last summer. It created a lot of debate and discussion. I had a lot of good meetings with the Moms Demanding Action, but I also had a lot of good meetings with responsible gun owners, and it was interesting for me because the Moms group was about the need for red flagging, mental health issues. We saw it happen in Maine. We need to strengthen that, and this proliferation of ghost guns that are really hard to track, and some things that we needed to do. What was interesting for me is the meetings that I had with responsible gun owners, it was almost another whole set of issues where they said, James, did you realize that if this bill passes the way it is, what about this? And if I can give you some examples from people from Millis who I had some conversations with. I got a call from a gun owner, a nice guy, and he said, look, he said, I understand there needs to be some reasonable controls. I've had this rifle for 50 years. It gets off maybe 2 shots a minute. He said, I've got to bring it in and get it broken down and get the barrel serialized. He said, that doesn't make sense to me. And I said, you're right. I said, that's not what we were after. I said, we're trying to stop people from making ghost guns in their basement and this proliferation, and we're trying to get a tracking system so we can put hundreds of thousands of these ghost guns are being confiscated. They're hard to track. So I said, I'm going to go to the chair. I said, let's see if we can change that. Similarly, a gun collector called me. He said, James, I've been collecting guns for years. He said, I'm not a threat. I said, am I going to have to give up these guns? I didn't think anybody who owned a current gun that was legal should have to give it back. And we got that in the updated bill. Hunters. Somebody put in that hunters were now going to have to get permission to go hunt on property that they've been hunting on for generations. Again, didn't make sense to me. I said, well, why on their property, no hunting allowed? That's their prerogative. They can still do that. But sometimes hunters don't even know who owns commercial property that's been around for years and years and years. So that got left alone. So I'd like to think that we took the good things that the activists wanted to strengthen the gun laws and kept them there. But we also listened to some of the responsible gun owners. You know, there are some people who say Second Amendment, they don't want any restrictions at all. I do think it's good that we don't have guns. I don't want guns in airports, schools, public buildings, and we put that in there. And by the way, this Supreme Court, which is somewhat gun-friendly, said that that's fine to do. I mean, they'd allowed for safe spaces. It does go to the Senate now. And I would recommend that anyone who's concerned about it from either side of the issue, follow what the Senate comes up with and write to your senators. And then when it comes back to the House, certainly they can reach out to me if they're supportive, not supportive. But what's very helpful, and this is what I really appreciated from some people just would call in, I don't like this, don't do it, or I love this. If there's something you don't like, tell me why. Tell me specifically what it is, and then I can do something about it. I think those were the conversations that I found most productive from all advocates from every side. So.
Thank you. Now let's move to a fiscal matter. There have been reports of a revenue shortfall upcoming in the Massachusetts, in the Commonwealth. So how will this shortfall purportedly affect your towns, especially in Millis?
Sure. This is going to be a challenge for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We are entering a time of fiscal restraint. And I think we need to be honest with people about this. The current fiscal year revenues are several $100 million behind what was projected, and the budgets that get passed and signed by the governor are based on those projections. Now, the governor has instituted what are called 9C rescission cuts. She can do that on her authority to balance the budget. Unlike Washington, we can't just print up money. We have to balance the budget here in Massachusetts. I like that about our state. But I'm not thrilled with the way they went about it, and let me share a little bit about what happened. They did the 9C cuts, and just to be clear with everybody, in the legislature, we have no authority to override them. We can't change it, we can't vote against it. It's an authority she has so that the budget can stay balanced. We had to do something. I don't dispute that point, but I thought there was a better way to deal with it. What they decided to do, what the governor's office decided to do, was to cut earmarks to communities and some other programs. The earmarks were cut by 50%. It was almost across the board unless the money was already spent. And then a number of other programs were cut so that they can get the budget in balance. What I thought they should have done was said, we have $8 billion in the rainy day fund. We're halfway through the fiscal years. We've promised a lot of money to cities and towns already. We're going to make good on those commitments, but you need to understand that the budget is going to get extremely tight when we do 25. There may not be any earmarks in 25. They chose not to do it that way. They said, well, we're going to cut 50% of earmarks now, but we'll still have a process where maybe you can get a little money next year. It gets a little esoteric. I didn't like that process. The other thing I didn't like is the messaging that came out of the governor's office. And some people might not like that I challenged them on this. But part of the messaging is, well, we didn't cut local aid. And I bristled a little bit at that. I said, well, wait a second now. Okay, technically, you didn't cut the line item to unrestricted government aid, but go tell Mike Kaczynski and Pete Berube, don't tell them that you didn't cut local assistance, because they've now got to find $50,000 for the study that was supposed to be done for the senior center and $12,500 for the money that I got in to buy a van. I mean, in essence, the Commonwealth is cutting assistance to local communities. Let's just be intellectually honest about that and say, here's what's going on, and this is why, and this is what we had to do. But we understand, yes, we didn't have to cut the unrestricted government aid, and we're proud of that. We actually are upping it in 2025, and I appreciate that the governor is increasing that aid by a few percentage points next year. But don't tell people you're not cutting them when they are, because they're going to go figure it out. Let's just be frank and honest with people. I think it's a better way to do that. The other related thing, and this is again where it gets sort of the inside players that are looking at the budget. The budget is an annual process, and it's really important that we get to a space where it's balanced and it's thoughtful and it makes sense. But the person on the street doesn't see that. They just see the Commonwealth. So when we say things like, and last year, Peter, I was proud of the tax cuts, most of the tax cuts that we passed. We did things for seniors, we did things for families, we adjusted the estate tax, which is going to help a lot of middle-class people. Those are some really good things we did. We also put in a pretty big corporate tax break and a capital gains tax. So now, which is to make the state more competitive in the long term, and okay, we went along with it. But people are now saying, gee, you just did $1 billion in tax cuts, you're giving $250 million to migrant aid, but you're making local cuts. The pushback, what we're hearing is, well, they're not really related. And like, okay, sure, technically, the annual budgeting process is its own process that needs to be whole, and these are different pots of money, and those are different things, and the tax breaks that we put in were to make the state more competitive long term. It's really not in play yet. But the person on the street doesn't see that. The person on the street sees $1 billion in tax cuts, $250 million to migrant aid, but you just took away part of the money for the senior center van in Millis. Let's just be honest with people, right? I'm not saying we didn't have to do some of those things, and we do have this crisis around migrant issues, and we have to have a stronger border. It's probably a topic for another day. I'm really concerned about the way we're dealing with it. I think we have to be thoughtful, but anyway, we'll save that one for next time. But let's just be honest about the budgeting process when we're dealing with small towns, when we're dealing with every town.
Thank you very much. Speaking of the governor, she has now outlined her priorities for the administration for the coming year. Sure. These priorities include items ranging from exploring transportation options in rural communities, a tax cut package, universal pre-K, a $4 billion request for affordable housing, and investments in literacy and veterans care, among a number of other things. Can you name one or two of these governor's proposals that you'd like to help move forward and possibly champion this year?
Sure. I thought she did an excellent job. I mean, I think the governor's doing a great job in general. I mean, I have some challenges to some of the ways they've done some things, but I think she's set out some important things. I mean, a couple of them that I'll mention that I think are pertinent for people here in Millis and really for all of us. This housing bond bill that she wants to get passed is so important for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I hear almost every place I go concerns about the cost of housing, seniors not being able to stay in their houses that towns they've lived in, young people trying to buy new houses, people trying to afford the taxes because taxes are getting so high in these small towns. This is a big challenge for us. The bond bill will provide some support for more affordable housing, but it's also going to fix the public housing that we have. It's also going to incentivize just more building in general. It's got a lot of other pieces in it that I think are important, like accessory dwelling units, where my take, by the way, is it's the ability to put in little flats within your current construct. I think if it's within the current footprint, people should be able to do an accessory dwelling. Just they should be able to do it. If they're going to add to the footprint, that's probably a conversation with the community and setbacks and what kind of parameters we have to put in place. But we've got to do something. It's interesting, and I really appreciate the town of Millis. I had a meeting, and Ellen Rosenfeld raised this issue with me, and I met with her, but also with Candace Avery and Scott Fuzzy and others. Here we are in the middle of a housing crisis in Massachusetts. In Millis, had a number of empty units because of the way the state rules work. Now, let me be clear. Public housing, I think, should be available to anybody who qualifies. Let's start with that as a premise. That's fine. That makes sense. And I know in the old days there was a lot of redlining. Some bad things happened. We get it. But let's also include common sense in the way people think about their housing. And all of us, when we think about where we're going to live, for the most part, well, I want to be near relatives or near the stores I shop in, or is there a train? All these things come into play. Millis got 100 applications for housing, they get like 6 back or something like that, because people got invited and they're like, well, Millis, well, that's 2 hours from where I am, or I don't know anybody near there. And I'm from around here. I grew up in Walpole, now in Halston. I love these towns. Maybe I'll end up in one of these towns someday in senior housing, who knows? But most people take into consideration where they want to live. And I'll give you another very quick example. Candace is working with somebody from Lowell who got assigned to Millis. And she was like, Millis. But she had no other place to go, and she took it. Couldn't get the train, had no car. People in the town were really helpful to her, and they tried to work things out. Meanwhile, at almost the same time, someone in Hopkinton was trying to find housing locally in Hopkinton. They get invited to a place in Lowell because they showed up on the list in Lowell. It's insane the way it's set up. So I took all this information and I met with the housing secretary. And I said, listen, we've got to do something about this. And in fairness to them, they've started to. They've actually put in some new parameters. They're giving local housing authorities a little more control and voice. If you've got somebody local who's eligible, they can push them up the list a little bit. I think it's a nice way of thinking about how can we blend this in a way that makes sense. Still have housing, and if somebody wants to go anywhere in the state, good for them, but let's also have some common sense. The other thing is, if we want to have an open system, people should have to put a little work into choosing, not just say, I'll live in any 200 communities. Well, then that costs us a lot of paperwork. What's wrong with saying to people, pick 10 communities you want to live in? So these are places that you research that really make sense to you. So there's been some progress with that. And also, I think the daycare thing you mentioned, this is a real concern. We have a double crisis going on. It's costing $20,000 plus a year for parents to put their kids in daycare. We also don't have enough daycare workers. So I mean, you have at the same time we have these twin challenges that are happening. So I do support if we could get funding for pre-K. I think that will help. I think there are some things we really need to do. We're in a different economy. I mean, in many families, not all, but both parents work. I mean, there's a lot of stresses, there's a lot of challenges. I think the governor has set out a good agenda. I think it's an ambitious one. I think we have to be helpful as best we can. But to the earlier conversation about budget constraints, there's only so much that we're going to be able to do. And I think we're going to have to be really thoughtful about how we go forward. But there's this other twin challenge in Massachusetts. How do we make the state more affordable and more competitive at the same time? And part of the rationale back on why we lower taxes is we want to make this place attractive, but we've also got to make it affordable for people too. So we have a lot of work to do in the years ahead.
Thank you, James, for addressing these questions. Now, in the second part of our program, let's turn the mic over to you and take a deep dive into what you're up to on Beacon Hill. Please tell us what's on the front burner for you.
Well, one of them I mentioned. I think housing is something I'm going to have to follow pretty closely in the years to come, and I mentioned those great local meetings that we had. I think this issue around PFAS and our water and what's going on with our environment, this is having tremendous impacts on the communities around here. My concern, and something I'm going to follow, there was a task force that the state had, this major task force. They haven't decided how the funding is going to work, so I'm going to follow that pretty closely. I want to make sure of a couple things. I want to make sure that communities that were hit harder by PFAS are rewarded, that it's not just here's a formula based on whatever, and the small towns don't get what they need, because it's millions of dollars to fix some of these systems. So I think if you had commercial industrial waste that was causing problems, like some of the communities around here, we also have towns that had firefighting academies that were using foam near water sources, and we didn't know. Sometimes things happen, and it happened 20, 30 years ago. We didn't know. So I'm not mad that happened, but now we have to say, all right, how do we figure out a way to make sure those communities get compensated, because they're looking at millions of dollars of cost in their system. What I don't want to happen, and this is always my concern, is I don't want our regulators to get ahead of our funding. And too often in Massachusetts, we dream up and we think up these controls, but we don't then pair it with the funding to take care of the problem. And you can't just keep heaping these problems on small communities without giving them the support that they need to deal with it. So that's going to be interesting to see how we deal with that issue. That's certainly something I do care about. We had a series of roundtables here in every town in the community. I don't know if that's part of this session, but we can sort of get into it. I met with seniors, we met with veterans, we met with small business, and they were really interesting because First of all, I think a big part of my job is to listen, is to hear what's on people's minds. What are they bumping up against? What are they seeing? I think it makes me more effective in my job and what I do. But we also have a great example of how listening to people in Millis can actually have an impact on how the state operates and does its business. I mentioned the housing woman. Here's another one. On the business side, there's some long-term issues around contracting and some frustrations. That's going to take a little work. We're going to deal more because it blends sort of local challenges along with state policy, federal policy. And then with the seniors, housing has come up a lot along with some other things. But what was fascinating with the veterans, in almost every session we had with veterans, what was mentioned, they said, gee, what we're finding is that depending on the branch of the service that you were discharged from, you got a very different close of service experience. You got a very different briefing and explanation of the benefits that are available to you as a member of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, someone who served in the military. And this was a theme that came up literally in every single community that we had. So I called the Secretary Santiago's office. He's the new Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I'm actually going to meet with him. We have a meeting next week. But I also sent him a quick note. And he actually happens to be both a veteran and someone who served in Peace Corps. And I remembered, and I said, John, I said, when we exited people from Peace Corps, we had a comprehensive system. I worked at Peace Corps for years. I ran the New England region. Because we wanted them to be clear on here are all the benefits that are available to you as someone who's been part of this system, been part of Peace Corps. Why can't we do the same thing for veterans? Why isn't there some kind of comprehensive package? Now, I'm not going to say it was just because of us and the people in Millis, because I'm sure they were hearing this from different parts of the Commonwealth. Lo and behold, a few weeks ago, Secretary Santiago's office comes up with this comprehensive package for veterans that are leaving service. Here are benefits that are available to you. It's a wonderful piece. I sent it out to the agents, to Larry McCarter and others here, and Bob and others here in Millis, because I wanted them to be aware of it. I certainly wanted it to be available to new vets as they come back, but also I want to say, hey, people at least listen to you. So once in a while, I'd like to think government does try to listen and at least help a little bit. But that was a great experience for me in terms of learning, but also being able to help forward some great ideas coming out of the community.
That's fantastic. James, thank you for updating us and chatting with us today about your latest efforts at the State House. If our viewers wish to contact you to follow up with any of the information they've heard today, how can they reach you?
Sure. There are two ways that you can contact me. First of all, thank you to Millis Cable for having me on your show. I'd love to be here. We'll look forward to coming back. But the best thing they can do is send an email. We're going to put that email right on the screen. Or they can call the office directly, and we are more than happy to help. If you have any questions about government, if you're not sure who to call, please call me, call us. We're happy to help and help you navigate. If it's a state issue, we'll hopefully intervene. But maybe if it's something local or federal, we'll put you in touch with the right people. But thanks again, it's great to be here.
And that wraps up our conversation with James Arena-DeRosa, our elected state representative from the Middlesex 8th District. I'm Peter Themistocles. Thanks for watching.